Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'll be discussing the 1929 film Sally with my friend Dan Pal, who writes the PalCinema television and music newsletter. Dan, you were just on the podcast a few months back, so welcome in for your second appearance on the podcast.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's great to be here. Great to check out some of these old films that I had never seen.
And before we get going, remind listeners who you are and where they can find your work online.
Yeah, so Dan Pal. Actually, you can find me at danpal.substack.com, where I write about film, television, and music. And I also write about I create short films about my garden and the Palanjo Park series. And that's been going on really strong. As a matter of fact, I had to move into a different room today because they're doing some work on a new Zen garden that I've got being put in. So
Very nice.
I didn't want you to hear any of that.
Much appreciated. Well, before we get into Sally, as always, I want to update our place in history. It's been about a month since our last nominated film was released back on November 19th, when we're here towards just before Christmas with this film. There's two notable births that I found in this month or so period. Dick Clark was born November 30th. Obviously, most people will know him from, if they don't know him from American Bandstand, then they know him from the New Year's Eve show for many years, which I think still has his name on it. I think they're still calling it Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve. And then the other notable birthday, December 13th of 1929, Christopher Plummer was born. Obviously a very well-known actor, Sound of Music, Knives Out more recently for the younger folks who may have seen him in that. And obviously storied career for him. So two pretty big names there in the entertainment industry that were born around this time in 1929. And then on the other side of the ledger, I didn't actually find any. I mean, there were certainly some notable deaths in the world, but nobody, I mean, they're just kind of random politicians and things like that. Nothing that really jumped out at me that relates to what we're talking about here. And then in terms of historical events, on November 28th, American explorer Richard E. Byrd and three companions made the first flight over the South Pole. And I mention this mainly because one of the films we're covering towards the end of this season, coming up, I think in February, is called With Byrd at the South Pole. And it's kind of documenting those travels down at the South Pole. So I don't know if any of that flight is included in the film because I haven't watched it yet, but it'll be interesting to see what was going on around that time down there. It's hard to believe that they had cameras filming down at the South Pole almost 100 years ago. I just can't wrap my head around it.
Yeah, wild.
Then November 30th, the only real sports news I found, the Hamilton Tigers beat the Regina Rough Riders to win the 17th Grey Cup for Canadian football. Canadian football still doesn't get enough love, so giving them a little bit of love here. Then on December 3rd, President Hoover delivered his first State of the Union address, which was actually only a written memo, or I guess you would call it. He didn't give it as a speech like we know presidents do nowadays. And then on December 4th, David Lloyd George, who is a member of the British House of Commons, expressed an opinion that a second world war was going to be inevitable without some sort of disarmament going on around the world. Obviously, we know that turned out to be true. So it's kind of interesting to see a statement like that coming 10 years or so before World War II would officially begin. December 10th, the Nobel Prizes for 1929 were handed out. I'm not going to read through what all of them were, but the Nobel Peace Prize went to Frank Billings Kellogg from the United States. And in film studio news, a fire at the Pathé Film Studio in New York ended up killing 11 people during the filming of a movie called The Black and White Review. So pretty big tragedy there, and led to some stricter fire codes, I'm sure, in New York City as a result. And then the last bit I had was December 13th of 1929. This one surprised me a little bit. So the House of Representatives had a subcommittee that approved plans to build a separate structure for the Supreme Court, which up until that point had been housed within the United States Capitol building, which I had no idea. I assumed that the Supreme Court was always in the Supreme Court building, and it had been since 17 or 18, whatever, but I guess that was not the case.
Quite honestly, I never even thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, I know they've got their own building now, obviously, but I just assumed that had been there for 200 years, and that's where they've been doing their stuff the whole time. But I guess they were just tenants of Congress for a while.
I guess. Wow. Huh.
Any other, historical notes you had?
Most of my notes are all in relation to, Sally, and I mean, although I should say it's in 1929, it's also the year of the market crash.
Yeah, we've covered that, a couple episodes past.
Yeah.
My episode with Kevin Pettit that we talked about, we went into some pretty deep, detail in that one, so obviously if people haven't listened to that, they can check that out, but it's definitely gonna start affecting films and the stories we see, I think. At this point, I think Sally was still made before all of those events, but it's gonna start showing up in the films, I'm sure.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Well, let's move on to Sally then. As I mentioned, Sally was released on December 23rd, 1929. It was directed by John Francis Dillon from a screenplay by Wildemar Young and A.P. Younger, and based on the 1920 musical of the same name by Jerome Kern, Clifford Gray, and Guy Bolton.
It stars Marilyn Miller as Sally Noskarova and Alexander Gray as Blair Farrell, and the great Joey Brown as Grand Duke Constantine, also known as Connie in the film.
Yep.
It has a running time of 103 minutes and was produced by First National Pictures and distributed by Warner Brothers Pictures.
And the only nomination the film received at the third Academy Awards was Jack Oakey's nomination for Best Art Direction. The film is available on DVD as well as on YouTube and on Amazon Prime as of this recording, so it's pretty easy to find if you want to check it out for yourself.
I found it on Tubi.
I like Tubi as well. So the film opens with Miss Sally Green working as a waitress at a restaurant. She dreams of being a dancer. She's trying to pay the bills with working at the restaurant. We see her kind of interacting with the other ladies working there, and they're pointing out that her admirer, who we come to find out is Blair. He's out on the street, kind of staring longingly through the front window as Sally is working, sowing some seeds of that potential romance coming down the road. And then in this kind of opening sequence, we get Sally waiting a table for a different man and his. I'm not sure if it was wife or girlfriend. So it's Hooper is the man and his girlfriend Rosie, and she kind of is, I guess, eavesdropping on their conversation a little bit and discovers that he's some sort of manager or talent scout and ends up asking him for an audition so she can dance. But in the course of serving his food, ends up spilling all of the food all over him, causing her to get fired from her job. So not a great start for Miss Sally.
Or maybe it was a good thing, because it allowed her to move on from that job where she really didn't have the opportunity to do the dancing that she so desired to. She tried slipping into just about any moment she could in whether it be in the kitchen or, in the restaurant.
Yeah, I think you're right. It probably was a fortunate accident, I guess, is what you call it. So in the meantime, we also find out that Blair is actually engaged to a woman named Marcia, whose mother, Mrs. Tenbrock, is kind of a high society lady, and she'll come back into play a little bit later. So Blair and Marcia are engaged, and then we obviously that's going to complicate things. Any sort of romance developing between Blair and Sally. So we jump ahead a little bit in time to a different restaurant, the Elm Tree Inn, which is owned by a guy named Pops Stendorf. And this is where we also meet Grand Duke Constantine of Czechoslovakia, which I thought was a fun combination of a bunch of different real places. But obviously,
Yeah.
we've seen that a lot in films where they kind of take a bunch of names and twist them a little bit. So the Grand Duke is working at a wait as a waiter at this restaurant, although it seemed, and I was confused a little bit between about the relationship between Pop Stendorf, the owner proprietor, and the Grand Duke. I couldn't tell. It was clear that Pops knew who the Grand Duke was, who Constantine is, but it wasn't clear whether he just kind of knew who he was and was playing along, or if he was actually part of the Duke's entourage. And it reminded me a little bit of Coming to America when I saw the two of them
Mm.
interacting. You know, you get the prince and the aide in Coming to America. I felt like these two kind of mirrored that setup a little bit.
Yeah, and I think there's a reference to the Grand Duke being penniless. I don't remember what the exact circumstances were, but he's penniless, which is why this Grand Duke, I guess he was he was forced out of his country, I think, and then
Yeah.
so he has to work in this restaurant, which explains why he happens to be there doing that job.
No, it wasn't entirely clear. It was a little bit odd, but we get a brief interaction between the two of them, and then Blair arrives at the restaurant as well. He runs into Sally, who's now working there as a bus girl, setting tables and things like that. So he kind of helps her in setting up the table. He says he's been looking all over New York at every restaurant trying to find her, and this is where eventually they sit down and talk for a little bit and share a duet, which is the song titled Look for the Silver Lining.
Look for the silver lining whenever a cloud appears in the blue.
It's the first, I think the first major musical moment that we get in the film, and it goes on for quite some time. I kind of went back and scrubbed through the video that I was watching, and that whole sequence goes on for at least, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes, probably more.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's sort of billed as a musical, which I suppose at that point any new talking movie had to have some songs in it, but that song doesn't come in till about 20 minutes
Yeah.
into the narrative, and you're right, it does kind of go on for quite a while, and apparently it was one of the only songs from the musical that made it into the film.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I did have a chance actually. I was looking for a copy of the script of the musical and couldn't find one anywhere, but there is on Spotify. I was able to find a recording of like a more modern recording of the musical, which is available. So I actually listened to that music before, and I think that kind of helped my understanding of the film
Huh.
because it filled in some of the gaps that we get a little bit later on as we get towards the second half of the film. But yeah, it was interesting to see that they only included a handful of the songs from the actual musical in the film version.
That's curious. When you say a modern recording of it, was it like a restaging of it? Like a revival later and they recorded it, or not from the 1920 movie?
No, it was not from the 1920 movie. I don't know exactly when it was recorded, but it was a very high quality recording, so it was obviously much more recent, than this one.
Hmm.
I'm trying to pull it up as we're talking here and see if there's any information.
So Marilyn Miller, she was in the 1920 stage production apparently and made that song popular in the 1920s. So, I guess it made sense that she would be in the film version of it, but I was unfamiliar with any other productions of Sally.
Yeah, so I was able to find it. So on Spotify, it's listed, one of the artists is listed as the Light Opera of New York Orchestra. Copyright on it is 2016. So it's within the last 10 years. I don't know if it's an actual full production or if it's just kind of a studio recording of it, but it was definitely helped my understanding of the movie to have listened to that first. And we'll link to that in the show notes so people can check that out if they want.
And it's interesting because that song became like a big commercial song in like the early 1970s. I remember it, look for the Union label when you are buying dot dot dot.
Look for the Union label when you are buying Lacoste dress or bra.
I never really knew where that song came from before that, but I remember, and it would be spoofed on the Carol Burnett show and
Yeah.
others. So that definitely had a life beyond Sally.
Yeah, and I think it was one of the, other covers that was closer to this time period. Judy Garland sang it. I think there was a film about Jerome Kern who wrote the musical, and Julie Garland played the Marilyn Miller character, so she got to sing it as Marilyn Miller in that movie.
Look for the silver lining whene'er a cloud appears in the blue.
Yeah, it's definitely had a life beyond this one. And I think it was actually, I can't remember if this was one of the ones, but in some of my research, a lot of Jerome Kern's songs were used and reused in various theatrical productions, and obviously that carried over to the films that were based on them as well.
Which makes sense, again, given the era when they were trying to, woo people in with film musicals to include then well-known songs into other films so that people, would go and see them, say, "Oh, there's that familiar, look for the silver lining song," or whatever it was. And, it would so that was pretty common during that era.
Yeah, and I was just looking up, so this song specifically, been covered by Aretha Franklin, Bing Crosby, and one of the more recent ones, Leslie Odom Jr. of Hamilton fame. So a lot of people have covered it. So anyway, back to Sally. So they have this duet, this singing "Look for the Silver Lining," and then as they finish up, Pops kind of comes out to the patio where they're sitting and sees them together. And Blair asks Pops that Sally be allowed to dance at this Elm Tree Inn at some point to show what she's capable of. So Sally goes off. Blair's buddies arrive. I guess he's there for some sort of bachelor party type thing. He said, I think he says at one point something about a bachelor party, but it's not really clear whether it's his bachelor party because he's engaged to this other woman, or whose party it is. But he does another here's another musical moment. He does kind of a song about Sally with all of his friends as backup. So another standout musical moment right there as well.
I can't remember, is that before or after I forget the name of the song, but there was a girl, there was a boy song that gets played several times over, or does that come a little bit later, or the
I
order?
can't remember. I think that is a little bit later. So we see later that night, Sally is kind of cleaning up after the restaurant is closed. This is where Constantine, the Duke, gets his chance to do a song and dance number. I'll be honest, I did lose a little bit of interest in this whole sequence. Although the song and dance number that they share is pretty good, and it's I was actually impressed by the amount of camera movement throughout a lot of the song and dance numbers, especially given how new the sound technology was.
Yeah, and she's pretty impressive. I mean, clearly, she was known as a musical theater star that danced, and
Yeah.
her movements were kind of big, and the use of her legs and such. There was almost an awkwardness to her dancing, but also very good and very skilled.
Yeah, I know, and Marilyn Miller was, I guess, a ballet, trained ballet dancer, which obviously comes across very well on screen, and not as much in the dance that she has with Constantine here, but later when she's pretending to be Madame Maskarova, which we'll get into in a few minutes. So Sally and Constantine have a dance together, and then as she leaves, Blair is there waiting for her. And I remember the title card said it was 3 o'clock in the morning, so he's been waiting around all night for her to get off of work so he can take her out and go for a drive in the middle of the night. Apparently, so they have kind of another moment, or 10 moments. It's another fairly long scene between the two of them where they're talking. I think they do a little bit more singing. I don't know if it's a reprise of the song earlier. And then, of course, we get a cut back not too long after that where Marcia and her mother, Miss Tenbrock, are waiting for Blair to come over for lunch, and they get a notification from the butler. Oh, he's not going to be joining them for lunch. Doesn't say why, but we kind of start to piece together that he's, focusing more on Sally than he is his own fiance at this point. So the next day at the Elm Tree Inn, we get some more scenes of dancers and performers, and eventually Sally goes to get ready for her performance. And of course, now we're starting to get the whole crew together. Hooper and Rosie from the diner at the beginning, they arrive to have dinner at this restaurant. And we see Constantine working as the waiter for their table while Sally gets ready. And then just before Sally is ready to go on, Blair arrives so that he can see her perform as well. And eventually, as after she's done, Hooper recognizes Sally. Hooper and Rosie together recognize her as the one who had spilled all the food. And so he kind of gets the idea that he's going to use her. She turns out that she's actually really good, even if she did spill food on him way back when. He can forgive that because I think he sees dollar signs.
Yeah, that was interesting. It was that transition. I sort of missed it for a moment. I'm like, wait a minute, shouldn't he still be upset with her? About the food thing, but apparently, he really needed another dancer, and she really showed, with one little brief little tap moment by their table that she could dance.
Yeah. So, and this is where it kind of gets a little bit weird. And again, it helped that I had listened to the musical before this. So his idea is apparently that he's gonna have her stand in as this Madame Noskarova who's supposed to be coming to this garden party at Mrs. Tenbrock's house the following day. I don't think that's ever really explicitly said anywhere, but that's kind of how we transition into the next sequence, which is at this big garden party where we get Sally arriving, impersonating Madame Noskarova. She's introduced to all these high society people. She's suddenly dressed in, amazing finery and beautiful jewel studded gowns and all that. Again, where where they get all this from, I don't know, but we just kind of got to go along with it.
Yeah, and where did she learn that accent?
Yeah, yeah. Overnight, she's gone from a New York girl to having a kind of French, kind of Russian, who knows what it is type accent.
We're just supposed to go with it. I think that's the idea.
Exactly. We just got to trust that they know what they're doing and go along with it. So she does a dance after she arrives and she's introduced to everybody. And I want to call this one out as the film, I guess, was originally shot in quote unquote Technicolor. It's not really what we know as kind of the Technicolor of the late 40s, early 50s, those big epics that we know so well. But there is most of the film is in black and white. There is a surviving segment here during this performance where it is in kind of color. You can see that there's some attempt to make it be in color there. So it's interesting to see that, especially at this time period.
Yeah, apparently that particular scene was found. The color version was found, but it was also in fragments. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to watch because it's suddenly the scene is in color, but then there are these other momentary fragments that are sepia toned. So that it kind of moves back and forth into this it's a pretty lavish number, but it's just sort of strangely moving back and forth between color and sepia tone. And interestingly, it also sounds like it's in stereo, which is not quite possible at the time. But I don't know if somebody at some point in time had created a stereo version of that particular number because it definitely it comes across as a much fuller sound than anything we had heard up to that point.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing as soon as, and I actually kind of went back and rewound to watch and listen to that transition. As soon as it cuts to those color segments, like you mentioned, the sound does vastly improve. Kind of that hiss that is on a lot of these older movies goes away for a few minutes, and it's just much better quality in that section.
Alas, I'm not a blossom so original, an orchid could not display me
So I would be interested to hear not just the color portion of kind of how they went about that, but the sound as well, especially again, because the sound was so new at this time.
Yeah, and I should point out too that I noticed that YouTube has this film. They got a couple of colorized versions of it, which because the film was originally released in, as you mentioned, I guess it was called two color Technicolor. That would have been the way audiences would have seen it in 1929, 1930. But because it doesn't exist, we can only get this particular version with this one scene, this one number in color. And you know what? I thought about looking at the colorized version, but then I thought, well, no, that would throw the whole thing off because I don't want to see somebody else's
Right.
manipulation of what they thought the color looked like since it doesn't survive.
No, I agree. I saw one of those versions as well, and I had the same thought, but I said, you know what, let's stick to how it's not supposed to be because it wasn't intended that way. But like you said, a more pure version of it.
Yeah.
So Sally goes off to change out of one outfit, and apparently she's going to come back on for another one. And that's we also get at this time Constantine arrives. Now he's dressed as the Duke. He is the Duke again, being introduced to all the high society folks here at this event. And then after he's all introduced to everybody, we cut back to Sally, who is in a room alone, and she starts to sing. And as she's singing, kind of staring out the window longingly, we see Blair, who has arrived at the party as well, and he jumps in and joins her in the song. They have a little little bit of, I call it the Romeo and Juliet moment, where she's up in the window and he's down in the garden, And she's again still trying to be Noskarova, and he's saying, "Oh, you remind me of this other lady that I really like, and but you're a little bit better than her." So he keeps kind of throwing these little jabs at Sally, saying that Noskarova is better than Sally, but then we find out later he's just messing around. He was just kind of playing with her to get under her skin a little bit. So she goes back out to do her next performance. And in the middle of that performance, during a little bit of a pause, Mrs. Tenbrook comes out and announces her daughter, Marcia, and Blair are engaged. And of course, this causes Sally to be visibly upset. She had not known anything about this, comes as a very big surprise. And you can only imagine what that would do in the middle of a performance like that.
Very sad. She's mean, that lady.
Yeah, I was not a fan of Miss Denbrock.
No, but obviously she's trying to keep him, within the high society
Yeah.
world that she wants him to be in. So
Yeah, and I think at one point earlier in the whole party sequence, we see Blair and his father talking, and the father saying, "Oh, we've been trying to get these families together for who knows how long." So it's obviously something that's been in the works for a very, very long time.
definitely.
So then, just at that moment, in a stunning coincidence, Pops, who we haven't seen in a while, arrives at the party with the police of all things and claiming that Hooper, the manager, agent, whatever, had kidnapped Sally, and also that Constantine, the Duke, is a waiter at his own restaurant. So eventually, they kind of everybody argues about this for a minute. Then eventually, Constantine and Sally kind of drop their disguises and they admit of who they are before heading out of the party together and leaving the rest of the high society people to their fun party. So then we jump ahead in time a little bit and we see Sally in some sort of apartment, and she's obviously still sad about not being able to be with Blair. But Hooper and Rosie come in with news that she's been given a contract to perform in the Ziegfeld Follies. And then we jump ahead a little bit more and we actually get to see a performance of those with Sally performing, doing the dancing. And this one, I think I clocked it. It was at least 7 or 8, maybe even more minutes that we see this. And it's no dialogue. It's just the music and the dancers doing this. I think they called it the butterfly dance in some of the things that I read. And we see more of Sally doing the dancing that we've seen throughout the film. And then at the very end, we Sally gets back to her dressing room. She gets a visit from Pops, who has brought her some flowers and a note from Blair. And we learn that Blair has been writing to her, and she keeps kind of sending notes back to him saying, "I'm not interested. I'm not interested." But she finally decides to forgive him. And in the very last scene, the two of them are coming out of a church. They've been married. We get the wedding march and they share a kiss for the camera. And that's the end of the film. So we assume that they went on to live happily ever after.
Yes. And I think that the ending is interesting because there's certain pre-code era elements here. And one of those is I think if this movie was made a few years later, she would have had to have given up her career. Whereas in this case, it appears that he's very supportive of her career. And I think that the film is trying, especially towards the end before they get together, it's trying to, explore that idea of, can a woman, have ambition and have a career, but also have the love that she needs.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that those two kind of come together. And you're right, we don't know exactly, where it's going, but at least we know that those two characters have come together, and she hasn't given up her career. Which I thought that was nice and bold for the time.
Yeah. No, that's a great point to make, that it definitely was able to do things because it was made at this time that it might not have been able to do later on. And again, I can't remember I'm just looking back through the song titles in the musical and I don't see. Okay, yeah. So in the musical, the final song, it's called Finale, Dear Little Church Round the Corner. So we assume that that's a wedding scene. At least I would assume that that's a wedding scene at the very end of the musical. So I think to that extent, it follows along with the original story.
Yeah. One of the other things that I wanted to point out, this is kind of like, sort of pre-code related. What I thought was the funniest scene in the film was when Connie, the Joey Brown character, and the Admiral are climbing up this ladder at this restaurant, which is a totally flimsy ladder. And the way they are sort of on top of each other, there's a very they're just physically so close. The element is it almost suggests like, okay, there's a little bit of like, stuff going on between these two men. And the Admiral has this very high-pitched voice that, we would say, okay, clearly that's the character is supposed to be gay. At least we would perceive it that way today. But it's very funny to watch the two of them as they physically are trying to go up this ladder. And then there's another moment later when I think there's an accidental kiss with Hooper.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and then Cooper, I think, makes a comment, something to the effect of, "Oh, I'm going to see him. Maybe I'll get another kiss." And it's just these little sort of lines of dialogue, little sort of shifts in terms of what the characters are doing that really suggests something that is pre-code. That is before we had to eliminate, all signs of anything that would be considered quote unquote, immoral,
Right.
and they're pretty funny.
Yeah, I noted those too. That scene that you're talking about with the guys on the ladder, that was another point, like I said, where I kind of lost a little bit of focus on it. It went on a little bit long. It was just
Yeah,
it felt out of place overall.
totally.
But it was funny, even if it didn't really have a place in the film. And some of the other scenes that I really liked that I thought were hilarious were the ones between Constantine and Pops when they're kind of Pops keeps, saluting to Constantine because he's the Duke, and Constantine goes, "Don't salute me, don't call me your highness," those sorts of things. I
Yeah.
thought those were really funny. And obviously we'll get to talking about Joe Brown as one of his most famous roles being in Some Like It Hot, and he's hilarious in that film. So he's
Yes.
definitely got the chops to man the comics part of the film like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll get into talking a little bit about some of the folks involved, starting with director John Francis Dillon. Worked as both an actor and a director in Hollywood. The only other film I saw in his filmography that was notable for me, at least, was his one of his earlier films, 1928's The Noose, which was nominated at the first Academy Awards. Richard Barthelmess was one of his two nominations for Best Actor for that year. I didn't recognize anything else in Dylan's filmography, but obviously he was fairly successful at the time. And then Wildemar Young and A.P. Younger, which I thought was an interesting combination of last names there. Very prolific screenwriters, over 80 films to Young's name, 60 films to Younger's name. And Younger was actually killed in some sort of accident a few years after this, 1931. And the only other tidbit I had on Waldemar Young was that he went to school at Stanford and played on the football team there. And then obviously we mentioned Jerome Kern at the top. The statistic I found was had written over 700 songs over his career. Old Man River, Can't Help Loving That Man, both from Showboat. Some of the notable examples, obviously this film or this musical that turned into a film, a couple of versions of the film is fairly well known, but I think probably Showboat remains probably his most famous, thing that he was involved with. And then Clifford Gray and Guy Bolton, who were involved with the musical as well, writing the lyrics and the book. Both of them worked with Kern quite a lot. They both worked with George Gershwin as well during that time. And and the little funny tidbit I found about Clifford Gray specifically was that for about 35 years, people believed that he was moonlighting as an Olympic bobsledder named Tippy Gray, Tippy in air quotes, and had two gold medals to his name at the 1928 San Moritz Olympics and 1932 Lake Placid Olympics. But this was, I guess, later debunked. Although the actual Tippy Gray and this Clifford Gray do have a little bit of resemblance if you look at pictures of them, at least the pictures that they have on Wikipedia. So funny little anecdote there that I thought was interesting.
I'm sitting you to talk about Marilyn Miller because she's interesting, and as we said, she was in the 1920 stage musical, and as far as film goes, this was apparently her film debut. And she was only in well, and I don't know if you caught this, Jonathan, but apparently she won. I thought this was actually pretty funny. She won the Photo Play Award in 1930 for best performance of the month for the for the month of March, which really? Who knew they did that?
Right.
But so she was an award winner. That is true
There
for
you
her
go.
vocal performance. But apparently she only did 2 other films and then tragically, like, died in 1937 from a nasal surgery,
Yeah.
which is so bizarre to think about.
Yeah, I saw that as well. It's sad because I mean, it seems like there's enough time between, the other 2 films were 1930 and 31, so she only did it for a couple of years. So I assume she was back on Broadway and doing stage performances between 31 and 36 or 37 when she died, but, what obviously she could have been even bigger. Would she have gone back to films at some point? Who knows?
Yeah, she was clearly very talented, and she had a very especially in this film, a very bubbly, positive personality. I'm not quite her accent at the beginning of the film, it's that sort of, like, mid-Atlantic, kind of British sounding accent, which isn't quite right for a woman in New York, but she's great. I mean, in terms of, like, just her energy for the entire film, and I would imagine that she would have had a pretty strong stage presence, before and after this.
Yeah, definitely. And I did 2 other notes that I had on her. For a while, in the 20s, she was married to Jack Pickford, who is the brother of Mary Pickford, who we've talked about before on the podcast. And her actual birth name was Mary Ellen Reynolds, and her stage name of Marilyn Miller came from her stepfather's last name. And then Marilyn was a combination of her own first name, Mary, and her mother's middle name, Lynn. And on top of that, also her name actually served as some of the inspiration for Marilyn Monroe when she changed her name
Oh.
in the, I don't know, 30s or 40s, whenever that was.
Yeah.
Because Ben Lyon, who was, I guess, an actor, told Norma Jean Baker at the time that she reminded him of Marilyn Miller. So that was part of the impetus there. So
Interesting.
interesting connection, which is a perfect connection to Joey Brown, who was in Some Like It Hot, also starring Marilyn Monroe.
Right. Yeah, right.
So what did you have on Joey Brown?
Well, I mean, Joey Brown, he was a pretty major star, at the time. He was one of the big box office stars and one of the highest paid actors. Oh, and I should also mention too, I read somewhere that Marilyn Miller was being paid like $1,000 per week or per hour or something.
Per hour, yeah.
Yeah, per hour. It's an incredible amount of money, which would be the equivalent of like being paid for the whole film, like a million point seven dollars like I guess in quoted 2022 figures. But Joey Brown, he was a major contract player in the 1930s, mid 1930s, up until I guess about 1937 or so. And then his contract ended and he really was a performer that kind of comes from this earlier era, which is sort of the silenced into talky era where he had elements of he had a big personality and he had this really ability to play physical humor very, very well. And that served him for a while until that started dumbing down. And then as time went on, he ended up doing various bit parts in films, especially in the 1950s, leading ultimately to probably the film that he's most known for, which is Some Like It Hot, and he died
Yep.
a few years after that.
Yeah. I didn't know the name Joey Brown, but I've seen Some Like It Hot, and throughout this film, I kept saying, "I know I've seen him in something," and then as soon as I saw that he was in Some Like It Hot, I'm like, "That's it. That's where I've seen him from." But yeah, I really loved him in that film. I thought he was excellent in this film too.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the other bits that I saw on him, he was actually the radio announcer for the very first Major League Baseball game, ever broadcast on the radio, which is Boston Braves and New York Giants game in 1925. And then he also did, a lot of traveling during World War II. Nowadays it would be, kind of the USO tour type stuff, but it wasn't officially called that yet. And as a result of traveling to support and, morale the troops, was awarded a Bronze Star, one of the only 2 civilians to receive that honor during World War II. So he wasn't just a funny face and a funny voice. He was, sounds like he was a pretty good guy all around.
Yeah, and also apparently a really big baseball aficionado. And it caught my attention that he was in a film in the mid 1930s where he played a Chicago Cub. And because I am from the Chicago area and a big Cubs fan, I was particularly interested in that. But apparently that continued throughout his life, that he was a big baseball fan. And really, that was a major passion that he included in various aspects of his career.
Yeah, and I did actually see somewhere, I think I saw correctly that and I didn't verify this, so it may just be hearsay, but I did see somewhere that he had actually received an offer to play for the Yankees at one point, but decided to turn that down to go on to an entertainment career instead. So obviously, a much longer term career move that he made at that point. But in a day when the Yankees were big, to kids of all ages. I'm sure that was a hard decision to make.
Yeah, definitely.
Who else? So Blair Farrell, the actor was Alexander Gray. He doesn't have a Wikipedia page that I was able to find, but I did look him up on IMDb, and he only appeared in about 10 films. And the description on IMDb said that he called himself, quote, a bashful man with a stutter, which I didn't hear any stutter from him. I thought his voice was actually really good in this film. So he will appear in one more film later on this season, Song of the Flame. It's Oscar nominated, so we'll get to see him one more time for films on the podcast at least. But interested to know kind of what happened with him and why he didn't. I didn't see when he passed away. I don't know if he passed away and that's why he no longer acted. But
No, according to what I found, he actually passed away in 1976
oh,
at the
okay,
age of 85.
wow,
So he lived a long time after his film career. And I agree. I mean, I thought he was also really good in the film. And he had a great look for the film, very handsome, and a surprising voice. Because as we said, the singing doesn't appear until about 20 minutes into the film, and only then we start hearing his voice. Like, wow, I had some training and some experience prior to this with singing.
So yeah, I wanted to just touch real quick on Pert Kelton, who plays Rosie, Hooper's girlfriend there. This was actually her first film role, and she would go on to briefly play Alice Cramden on The Honeymooners with Jackie Gleason before she was blacklisted and ultimately dropped from that show. So a
Wow.
little bit of an up and down there as well.
I knew her name sounded familiar, and I did not research her, but now that you say that, that's right. Wow, that's fascinating to me.
And then the last one, Ford Sterling, who plays Pops, very long film career going all the way back to 1912, 270, over 270 film appearances. Obviously, a lot of those are shorts and silent shorts, things like that. He was actually working as a comedian at Keystone Studios when Charlie Chaplin first arrived there in 1914. So another classic connection there. I wasn't, very familiar with that name really. So
Yeah.
interesting to see that he was in that many films and doesn't have the same level of recognition as Chaplin or Buster Keaton, folks like that.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
like I said earlier, I thought him and Joey Brown as the two there, Constantine and Pops, those were some of my favorite scenes. Was the ones between the two of them.
Yeah, I agree. They definitely added the comic relief. She was the dancer. He was the kind of, the good-looking, male lead, but the two of them brought all of the humor, most of the humor to the
Yeah,
film.
yeah, definitely. So obviously, we mentioned the musical was extremely popular. It came out in 1920, ran for I think about 4 years before it was finally various revivals and restarts, but finally taken off of Broadway. And this is actually the second adaptation of it. It was previously made into a silent film in 1925, which I'd be interested to check out if that's still around to see how, obviously, there's no dialogue that you can hear, but how does did it have any of the songs as accompaniment
Yeah.
or anything like that? So it might be another interesting thing to check out at some point.
I also, and I don't know if you're going to touch on this, but the fact that the only nomination that this got was for its production design or art direction. I think it's interesting. I mean, as I was watching the film and looking at it, like most of the sets, because it was filmed at Warner Brothers, most of the sets seemed like sets and very busy and very kind of claustrophobic until that big scene, the big garden fete, what is that? Like really the climax of the film. that was a pretty big, lavish set, and I think that's probably where the film got its attention for its, for its art direction because it is quite a beautiful set, and it does look pretty great in that short little colori or not colorized, but that color segment that we talked
Yeah.
about earlier.
Yeah, no, I had the same thought. I had actually written a note down in, like, the first third saying it was nominated for art direction, but I don't see it. I'm not super, it seems pretty simple, pretty basic at this point, and then as soon as that scene showed up, I'm like, "Okay, I get it now."
Yeah, unless it was that ladder, maybe it was the ladder.
Yeah, that part of production design, I didn't understand one bit, but, I guess it was
Right.
there for the gag is that's probably the only reason it was there.
Yeah.
But yeah, and while we've been talking, I did look up, you'd mentioned earlier, Miller's rate of $1,000 per hour when the film was made, which amounted to $100,000, which I find it a little bit hard to believe that she only worked on this for 100 hours. I mean, that's like 2.5 weeks of working 40 hours a week at $1,000 an hour. Maybe they cranked it out that fast, but it seems a little bit unbelievable. But I did look that up. So $1,000 in 1929 is equivalent to almost $19,000 now. So I can't imagine. I would love to be making $19,000 an hour. I'd be quite happy with that.
Just think just how much we've been making this hour.
Yeah, yeah.
We deserve it, but,
You and I could be almost $20,000 richer if we could command that rate. Yeah, so we've talked about the that color portion. I actually wasn't able to find any really contemporary reviews of this. A lot of times, places like Variety and New York Times, Photoplay, those will all have reviews. I'm sure they're out there somewhere. I just didn't have a chance to really, do a whole lot of digging. Were you able to find any reviews of the time for this one?
no, and I really I mean, I had again, this is another I had never heard of this film before, and, so it doesn't surprise me that it hasn't, received a more contemporary review because it's just I mean, it is what it is, certainly for its time. But and I do think that, there's people that would be pretty entertained by it, but I
Yeah.
haven't seen any reviews.
Yeah, I did find a more recent post someone had made. There's a website called Comet Over Hollywood. The writer there, J.N. Pickens, back in 2015, wrote, "Honorable mention for the film goes to Joe E. Brown, who is the most memorable part of this film." And he also finishes up by saying, "I have no doubt that Sally was more enchanting of a story on the stage," which I
That's what
tend to agree with. I have a feeling if you're watching it on stage, it's going to be a little bit more engaging than this was.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
So we talked about you mentioned a few minutes ago about the nomination for best art direction. Obviously, that went to King of Jazz. Yes, King of Jazz was the winner that year, and I've seen most of the nominees for that category. I'll have finished that category by I think mid-December or thereabouts. So I'll hopefully be able to give my vote for which one actually deserved the win. But so far, I think I'm trying. I'll leave my final thoughts on that category until we get a little bit further on because we do still have a couple of films to cover in that category. So, anything else you wanted to touch on before we give some final thoughts and ratings?
No, I mean, well, one of the details online that I found was that this was billed as or it was the fourth all talking, all color film when it was released, which I thought was pretty significant for its time. But again, there was a huge need to make more films that were talkies that had music that had for lavish numbers and to do it in color. And this would have been after the Broadway musical, I believe, was released. And so it kind of it makes sense. But I thought that was significant that it was the fourth such film.
Yeah, I agree, and one other note that I had was just the fact that the music and the dancing and the performances in this, I think, were far better than anything we saw from the quote unquote musical films nominated the previous year for the second Academy Awards. I People can go back and listen to my conversation about the Broadway Melody. People can go back and listen to my conversation about Weary River. Those were some of my lowest rated films among those Oscars. Were some of those musicals, and I enjoyed this much more than I did any of those overall.
And I think it just says something about the fact that this was a successful Broadway show The songs were by some very, very, significant hot writers of that particular time. And, she was a huge success on stage. And so it makes sense that this one would maybe stand out
Yeah.
to others. It's too bad that it maybe didn't get maybe more attention. I'm kind of surprised that it didn't get actually more nominations. And maybe had there been a supporting actor category at the time, Joey Brown would have gotten in, but that didn't happen yet.
Yeah, no, definitely if we had all of the categories we have nowadays, I have a feeling, like I said, Joey Brown as a supporting actor. I would I don't know if cinematography was enough with some of the the things it was doing, moving the camera. Again, we're kind of in that stage where we've stopped to put the camera in one place so it stays quiet, and now we're starting to move it around a little bit, but wasn't anything revolutionary cinematography wise, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. And also that there were times, and this kind of calls in terms of the direction where the blocking, especially I recall just an early scene, I think it might have been between Connie and I forget who the other actor was, where they were having a discussion, but they were not facing each other. They were facing the camera. And, that's a very kind of stagey thing to do. It's a very not quite as sophisticated as what maybe other filmmakers had already attempted and excelled at even by that point. So I'm not surprised that it didn't get the attention for the cinematography or the
Yeah.
direction.
Well, I will give my rating first. I ended up giving this a 7 out of 10. It was kind of a low 7, but I actually really enjoyed it much more than I thought I was going to. We've talked about the strong performance from both Miller as well as Brown, and basically everyone who we've talked about had a pretty strong performance, I think. So it was strong there. I enjoyed the music a lot more than I've enjoyed the music in a lot of these other films. So I think it was overall an enjoyable experience for me. So I think I'm going to give it a 7.
Yeah, and I think I might go one higher. I mean, I'll give it an 8 just because I wasn't expecting much. And the fact that the what's available for this film in terms it's a very scratchy, print in terms of the visual quality. For what the film was and how it came through, regardless of that, I was really quite entertained and I really kind of enjoyed the whole experience watching it. I wasn't rolling my eyes. I wasn't, yeah, some things were a little uneven and they kind of showed up at times when you were like, wait, why is this slapstick scene here? Why is this, number here? But, I thought it was a pretty entertaining film all around.
Agreed. Well, as always, I will include a list of resources, links to any of the articles, reviews, other films that we've mentioned throughout the episode, as well as where you can watch Sally for yourself online. And Dan, thanks again for coming on the show to talk about Sally. Remind people where they can find your work one more time, please.
danpal.substack.com. Look for PalCinema and you will find me and all my work.
And don't forget to follow the Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. And be sure to come back for next Friday's episode of the podcast where I will be discussing the film Their Own Desire. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the movies.